Agriculture and the Neolithic Revolution. Historian Lauren Ristvedt defines agriculture as the domestication of plants, causing it to change genetically from its wild ancestor in ways that make it more useful to human consumers. 12 She and hundreds of other scholars from Hobbes to Marx have pointed to the Neolithic Revolution, that is, the move from a hunter-gatherer world to an agricultural one, as the root of what we today refer to as civilization. Without agriculture we don't have empires, written language, factories, universities, or railroads. Despite its importance, much remains unclear about why and where agriculture began. Instead, scholars hold a handful of well-regarded theories about the roots, pun intended, of agriculture. Most scholars agree that the Ice Age played a fundamental role in the rise of agriculture, in the sense that it was impossible during the much colder and often tundra-covered period of the Pleistocene, but inevitable during the Holocene thawing. Only 4,000 years before the origins of agriculture, the planting of anything would have been an exercise in futility. During the last glacial maximum, 24,000 to 16,000 years ago, average temperatures dropped by as much as 57 degrees F near the Great Ice Sheets. 13 of Spain or the North American Great Plains were increasingly covered in ice, but also that other areas around the world could not depend on constant temperatures or rainfall from year to year. Pleistocene foragers had to be flexible. The warming trend of the Holocene, by contrast, resulted in consistent rainfall amounts and more predictable temperatures. The warming also altered the habitats of the megafauna that humans hunted, alterations that in some cases contributed to their extinction. Therefore, as animal populations declined, humans were further encouraged to plant and cultivate seeds in newly thawed soil. This glaciation meant not only that today's fertile farmlands. When we start to examine other factors that allowed humans to transition to agriculture, we find that the climate factor looms even larger. For example, agriculture was usually accompanied by sedentarism, but we see communal living and permanent settlements among multiple groups of hunter-gatherers. Homo sapiens had also begun to domesticate animals and plants. Alike during the Pleistocene, humans were already being buried alongside dogs as early as 14,000 years ago. 14 As we'll see below, gatherers were developing an increasing taste for grains long before they would abandon a foraging lifestyle. Essentially, humans were ready for agriculture when climate permitted it. We discuss elsewhere the timing of agriculture's appearance in all of the continents, but, generally speaking, by about 8,000 years ago, farmers in West Asia were growing rye, barley, and wheat. In northern China, millet was common 8,500 years ago. In the Americas, the domestication of maize began around 8,000 years ago in Mesoamerica, while at about the same time, Andean residents began cultivating potatoes. Once all of these areas realized agriculture's potential as a permanent food source, they began to adapt their societies to increase their crop consistency and crop yields. We'll discuss how agriculture affected societal development below. First, farmers of West Asia, or the Fertile Crescent. In later chapters we will discuss Mesopotamia, the area between the Euphrates and Tigris rivers. That agriculture would make the cradle of civilization. See Map 2.1. However, the incubator of Mesopotamian and Fertile Crescent agriculture and cultural patterns dated back to the foragers of the nearby eastern Mediterranean, thousands of years before. The rye, barley, and wheat in West Asia were first harvested by late Pleistocene. Foragers called the Cabrins who ground wild wheat and barley into a porridge. 15 Cabrins consumed the porridge as part of their broad spectrum diet that also included land mammals, birds, and fish. Advancing into the Holocene, we see the Natufian adaptation, where residents of this same area began to see the benefits of sedentary living in a precursor to the advent of agriculture. The Natufians consumed the same rye, barley, and wheat that their Cabrin predecessors had, but because their Teeth were well worn. It appears they ate relatively more of it. Having a constant source of these grains enabled their eschewing long hunting or gathering sojourns. Instead, the Natufians drew more of their meat from in and around Lake Hula in modern Israel. Near Lake Hula was Ain Moha, one of the earliest examples of year-round human settlement and an important precursor to sedentary agriculture. Another permanent settlement in Southwest Asia seems to have been more directly responsible for the decision to actually domesticate grain, rather than simply cultivate wild varieties. Abu Hurayya in Syria was deeply affected by the Younger Dryas event of 11,000 years ago, an event which caused many of their wild food staples to disappear. Rather than migrating out of the area, the Abu Hurayrans cultivated rye. Soon afterward, other sites in the Levant began to see the planting of barley, while wheat was cultivated in both the Levant and Anatolia. 16. 1.6.2 First permanent settlements in West Asia, of the Fertile Crescent. The transition from foraging to collecting to cultivating took place over several centuries, but these gradual changes did serve to mark a very distinct era of permanent settlement during the Neolithic period. Increased rainfall around 9600 BC meant that the Jordan River would swell first farmers of West Asia, or the Fertile Crescent. In later chapters we will discuss Mesopotamia, the area between the Euphrates and Tigris rivers. That agriculture would make the cradle of civilization, yearly, in the process depositing layers of fertile soil along its banks. This fertile soil allowed locals to rely on agriculture for survival. Soon after they founded Jericho just north of the Dead Sea. Perhaps the very first time in human history that a completely viable population was living in the same place. At the same time, by Jericho's height around 9000 BC, the settlement's population reached the hundreds. This increase cannot be considered an urban boom, of course, and the transition away from foraging occurred gradually. For example, excavations from this area have unearthed no separation of tasks or dwellings by gender or skill. However, by the end of Jericho's development, maintaining large populations in one place would prove to produce other extensive adjustments. Jericho's residents did distinguish themselves from their hunter-gatherer predecessors, however, through their relatively extensive construction projects. They used mud bricks to build a wall that encircled the settlement, probably for flood control, a tower, and separate buildings for grain storage. The former foragers now living at Jericho could rely on fish or other aquatic creatures for meat as they experimented with permanent settlement, but those foragers living further away from large bodies of water would need another source of meat. This need increasingly was met by animal domestication. Domestication would prove to be a slow process, as humans learned the hard way that zebras bite, impalas are claustrophobic, and bighorn sheep do not obey orders. In other words, some animals cannot be domesticated, but this is information only understood through trial and error. By about 7500 BC, however, humans in the Taurus and Zagros mountains employed selective breeding to eventually domesticate mountain sheep and goats. The temperament and size of pigs and cows delayed their domestication until the 6000s BC, but this process proved equally, if not more important, than that of sheep and goats. As agriculture and animal domestication progressed, settlements around the Mediterranean became larger and more sophisticated. By 7000 BC on the Anatolian plateau, Catalhook reached several thousands of inhabitants. The residents at Catalhook buried their dead, constructed uniform adjacent houses with elaborate designs painted on their interior walls, and had multiple workshops where, among other activities, they wove baskets and made obsidian mirrors as well as daggers with carved bone handles. Catalhook denizens wove wool into cloth, developed a varied diet of peas, nuts, vegetable oil, apples, honey, and the usual grains, and improved weapons technology with sharper arrows added to their use of daggers and lances. These gains may seem modest by our standards, but the legacy of communal living and ultimately, political centralization that they introduced was extraordinary. Jericho and Cattlehook were surely some of the most notable early settlements, but they were not alone. The appearance of these two settlements was accompanied by the increasing presence of village life across the world. Most early agricultural villages in Southwest Asia and around the world were very similar in appearance. They had around 20 residents and were organized around grain cultivation and storage. Small huts were organized in a loose circle, and grain silos were placed between each hut. Labor was a communal activity, and village members all spent time hoeing the fields or hunting. The most valuable asset to a community was the grain itself, but neither it nor the land where it grew belonged to one individual. This model existed for hundreds and even thousands of years in some areas, until the villages stopped hunting and domesticated animals. For many scholars, the abandonment of hunting represents the real Neolithic revolution. As communities completely abandoned hunting and gathering, they dedicated more energy to warfare, religion, and construction. In consequence, dwellings and settlements grew, along with a concomitant focus on tool and weapon making.